Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, Proactive Time Management, Solving Tomorrow's Issue Today, presented by our Head of Leadership Growth at Watermark Learning, Dr. Jay Pugh. My name is Mariela Salinas, and I'll be assisting and moderating our session today. We are in Zoom for today's webinar, and we will be sharing a copy of this recording with all of you in an email after the webinar. We do encourage participation throughout these sessions, so please use the chat or that Q&A option for our short Q&A after the presentation. Educate 360 is so excited to present this webinar today. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to you, Dr. J.
Hey, thank you so much, Mariella, and welcome everybody. My name's Dr. Jay Pugh. I'm our head of leadership and development with Educate 360, and I've been in this space for probably about 9 years now, and been in the teaching, training, education space for almost 2 decades. And so it's been an experience for sure. And so I'm happy you're joining me on this session about more proactive time management. I think there's certain things we see in time management that can be effective, especially from like, well, how do I tackle sort of these processes versus these processes? What do I do first? How do I make sure that I have these things in play? And so I want us to kick off a little bit, and we're going to go to type in the chat for a minute for these responses. I want you to think about how many of you, first by a show of hands, are in a space of remote management where, like, you may not be, it may be remote project management, it may be remote program management, but you're more in a remote and or a hybrid space to where you're not all in the same location all the time. Just by a quick hand raise first and foremost. Wow. Mostly remote. Perfect. I like mostly remote. Hybrid's good. Yep. Love this. Love what I'm seeing right now. And the reason why I bring this up is because part of the challenges that come with this, what do you think the biggest roadblocks of sort of working remotely, whether it's working hybrid, what's sort of the biggest challenge? The communication. Yeah, communication is typically one. Availability. I love that. There can be sometimes some distractions, some time zones, some international versus national communication, response times. Yeah, we've lost some connectivity, number one. I like that. There could be commitment sort of components. How do we keep everybody engaged? And the other thing that typically comes into play is what I love that Danielle mentioned is keeping in the attention and the focus and having, and what Julian said was sort of this understanding of this sort of response time. Typically, when you're working face to face, it's a very, I don't want to say reactive mentality, but if something hits the fan, let's say, what ends up happening is that people are running into these issues where you could just hop in and just solve them right now. And the biggest challenge with having a little bit more of this hybrid remote workforce typically comes into this space of we have to move from this reactive to proactive mentality. And so typically when we're sort of in this dynamic of sort of the remote workforce, what ends up happening is we run into issues to where the following happens. There's a problem that happens. If you were working face to face, you could hear that problem happening. You could hop in, dive in, get it taken care of ASAP. Whereas when you're remote, it has this sort of what we call out of sight, out of mind mentality. And so because of this, our own calendar and our own sort of daily management of our processes kind of puts us in a vacuum. And because of this, what we find ourselves doing is only sort of responding or waiting to respond to the urgent as it goes. What we really need to start shifting to is more anticipation of current issues as they're occurring. We have to be a little bit more proactive about looking to see what challenges could come in advance versus waiting on them to happen so that now we're putting out fires. And because of this, what happens, and I love what Marion just said too, is sometimes when we say, oh, now that does that mean we just have to have a ton more meetings now because of this? No, no, no. That's not necessarily what that means there. So it is keeping some things under the understanding that, you know what? we might need to really define what parameters are for the management of our calendars and the management of our communication. So as we go through this, I'm going to show you a couple really cool things that we have along the way. And as we've done this, I'm going to show you, and it's not really personal things. I've tried to make sure that, I don't have anything personal up, but I'm going to give you a little bit of some sort of teasers on some things that I do to sort of manage a little bit of what we have. And so as we go through, I hope you're ready to see some fun stuff that we have planned. And so as we go through, and I just got a copy of, yes, if you are part of this, you will receive a copy of that slide deck or the recording rather. Okay. So as we go into this sort of challenge, I want us to think first and foremost, how many of you, show of hands, feel like you're firefighters on a daily basis? Meaning that we're just putting up fires and fires and fires and fires. And we're just, oh, there's a fire here, there's a fire there. And it just feels almost as a state of exhaustion. Anybody just kind of tired? Putting up both hands, love that. Frequently. So I will love to say that I can't. So there's going to be a little bit of a bad news here is that the fires will never fully go away. But what I will tell you is hopefully we can reduce or control some fires as they go. And so that's going to be what I teach you as we go through. And the first thing I would love for us to do, and it's noble to be the firefighter, right? It's noble to be the firefighter. It's amazing to be the person that's putting out the fires. There's something truly admirable about it. The other thing though that comes into play though is we might have to start being Smokey the Bear with our options. And I bring this up because when we do this, what we got to look at is three things. Number one is there a way to eliminate the fire from happening again? I really try to make sure that before I jump from one fire to another fire, the first thing I always try to do is slow down and ask sort of three questions. The first one is there a way I can actually eliminate this fire from happening again? And I'm going to give some real life examples of things that have happened over the time. How many of you get sort of bombarded with questions over a period of time, over and over? And sometimes they're the same questions over again. I bring this up because if you're running into that, what do we think, right? Similar questions, different scenarios. And this is great, Gloria. I love seeing this, right? So in this case, what I want to mention is that there's things you can do or create or set up to potentially eliminate the fire from happening again. And Daniel, that's the big thing is that we have to create what is called retrospective. I love the idea of lessons learned, Donald, as well. What the idea behind eliminating the fire from happening again means is what can I create, build, or set up so that we don't run into these fires over and over and over and over again. So some examples that I run into, and I'm going to go to sort of my sales team. The sales team that I work with are amazing. I'm going to tell you they're incredible account managers. They're very strong in the way that they do things. One of the things though that happens, and I want you to think about this, we have 70 different course offerings. What do you think the likelihood that they're going to memorize and know all 70 of these like the back of their hand are? What's the likelihood of that? Little, slim, right. And it's not because it's not that they're great at their job. It's just because they have that and then they have other courses that they're selling. And so what I'm looking at is, wow, guess who they're going to keep asking for questions in this case if it's over and over and over and over and over again. And that's where it's going to go to me. So it got to a point where it's like I could keep putting out the same fires over and over again. Or this, I love what I see, is time for a wiki. And so what we created was, and the thing is with a wiki, we didn't overload the wiki. We tried to make sure that we had sort of pieces there that was like a little bit easier. And within that, what we created was sort of a quick reference guide. This was like the top 5 to 7 things that they truly need to know. One is differentiation of our courses. One is um, one is getting into sort of a one pager of all of our courses. And so I'll show you kind of something with this, and it is a little bit more of an internal thing, but for the most part, as I bring this up, I'm going to show you one thing with this in this internal place that we have is that we have sort of our pillar release. And so when we had this, and please forgive that in sort of SharePoint, sometimes it doesn't come in clean. If you download it, it's different. But what if we created a one pager of all of the courses that we offer? What if we broke them down by the different areas that they could see? Now, this isn't going to be built by itself, right? And so this is something that we had to look at is what if we created a one pager that made life a lot easier for our salespeople to know which courses to go to and find? That's just one example of this, right? Did this eliminate the fire of, say, for instance, having every single person, never ask us a question again? No, but did it eliminate a fire of knowing that we have a resource with all of our pages? Yes. So in this case, box checked for that. Now, what happens whenever it's like, boy, I know what some of you are thinking. Jay, what happens when you just know that the fire is never going to be eliminated? What can you do instead? What I like to do is I go to 2A or 2B, or not to be. I guess that is a question. Sorry, that's my bad Shakespeare joke for the afternoon. Just bear with me. There'll be a couple more dad jokes along the way. But the way that I try to look at this is one of two things. Number one, I try to look at this from a space of reduction or controlling of a size of a fire, or extinguishing fires faster. And so I go to those two places because this is really where the magic happens when you're trying to be more proactive, whether you're in a project manager role, a program manager role, a leadership role. It doesn't necessarily matter because when you're looking at these two things, what you're trying to do is improve process. So in this case, what I looked at was additional fires we were running into. And Gloria brings up a key thing is that most fires can be created when a knowledge base is created, when it's also maintained and referenced. The other thing that we have to do is we have to educate and not enable by answering the same questions over and over again. So what would still happen is even though we had this wiki, there were still people coming with questions and coming with questions and coming with questions. What would happen then is I would say, hey, please go to the link for the wiki. The first time I provide the link for the wiki, the second time I tell them to go back to the wiki. Sometimes we have to reinforce and show them and educate. Education is a huge way to reduce or control sizes of fire. The problem is that people feel like that takes too much work. It takes work up front, but it takes the headache off the back end. And absolutely, it's like teaching the person to fish. So I'm going to give an example of ways that we've reduced or controlled the size of the fire as it comes into play. Reduction or controlling. Other areas where we ran into play with sort of our sales team was certain areas of, Jay, what's the difference between, or I'm running into a situation where, they say they want this course, but I don't know that it's the right course for them. Well, what can we do to reduce or control the size of that fire? Well, what I did was I created a common list of Q&A questions that we ask our clients. And the reason why is because it's no longer about the course that they need. It's much more about the cultural components that they're trying to find. And so I set them up with sort of this list, this walkthrough of some key questions. And yes, they can make it their own and find that comfort with it because they're amazing salespeople, as we talked about. But coming up with those list of questions allows them to reduce or control the size of the fire of, well, they want this and they want this and they want this and they want this. What should we do? Now we've sort of streamlined that in. So I look for ways to reduce or control the size of the fire. The other thing is that even still, building a solution. How many of you have to build solutions? It's a little bit tiresome. It can be daunting. Extinguishing fires faster. is something we can do. Those fires aren't going to go away, but how many of you have a kickoff session when you're doing project management, when you have a sort of a kickoff? Why do you do the kickoff? Think about this for a minute. What does that do to extinguish fires faster if you have a kickoff first with your projects? Number one, you set the expectations. People can ask their questions. There's assignments and there is alignment. Right. So now what you've done by having a kickoff is you've reduced and controlled the size of the fire. You've reduced and controlled because now there's clarity, there's common objective, and you've set that baseline. That's reducing and controlling the size of the fire. So you're doing it whether you realize or not. But once again, the key word here is that we must be proactive. We must be intentional about looking for those things rather than waiting for them to hit us. Personal control of the size of the fire. How many of you get these questions? Hey, Jay, are you free? Hey, Jay, you free at 2 o'clock today? Hey, Jay, you free at 1? Hey, Jay, you free at 11:30? Jay, you free tomorrow at 9? Jay, you free? Jay, do you got a couple minutes now? How many of you get, how many of you that just hit you clean here? Oh, all day long. I will tell you that that is a fire that I have almost eliminated. That is a fire I've truly reduced or controlled. And no, the answer is not that I just stopped meeting with people. That's not the case. What I have done is that's where I go to. I love that, Donald, is I'm going to show you some things, is that we have some components where as I'm going through, if you need something, you get a call scheduled on my calendar and I will be available to meet with you. And we will go through and we will have these pieces that we need to get taken care of. You get something on my schedule, I don't need you to ask me if I'm free. So I truly follow a genuine shared calendar system with color codes and different breakdowns of this. And so whenever I go to sort of the categorization of things, what I want to kind of show you is when I categorize things, I really pay attention towards the breakdown of how I'm using these. Is this an operations component? Is this a sales need? Is this a client call? Is this my own team that needs something from me? Is this just something that I need to be unavailable for because I have to get this taken care of? Or is this something that I need to be proactive with my own time? And that's what my purple time is proactive times. And that's the thing, Juan, is that now, once again, to reduce or control the size of these fires, I want us to make sure that we are owning it and that we hold to it. Are you available? I am not available. So I'm a huge fan of this. Yes. And so, Adna, I love that. The Nerds Gotta Hang is one of my favorite meetings of all time. And the reason why is because as our heads of our different areas of our businesses, we have a head of AI, we have a head of cybersecurity, we have a head of project management, and we all get to hang out and just at least brainstorm ideas once a week where we get to do so. And it's really a great collaboration session with us. And what's great is that we all get along, so it's such fun to be able to have that. It's just a reminder that, hey, this doesn't have to be work, but we can actually brainstorm for just 1 hour. Just give us 1 hour. And I love the GSD. The GSD stuff is my purple time, right? And Lenice, great question here. Some examples of this, you can break down categories by as follows. Number one, you can break them, how I break them down is by departmental need. Departmental need. So for me, how I break it down is this an upper leadership group, or is this more of our operations team that needs something? Is it our sales team that needs something? Is it our PMO? Is it our content team? Who needs something from us, right? The other piece that you can break this down by is by urgency. Some people use what's called a red, yellow, green system to where it's like green is something that can be flexible. I can move this. I can adjust this. The other pieces is yellow is like, look, I need to keep this out there and make sure that this is known. And red is I cannot move this. This is the immovable force. So you can create it by urgency. You can break it down by departmental breakdown, but I'm a huge fan of doing this because it allows me to have the working room that I need to take care of it. And what Marion just said is really big is my calendar is up to date is one of the greatest phrases you can use because at the end of the day, you are the captain of your ship. You are the captain of your ship. So I do want to emphasize that as well. So the last thing that I try to look for is how do I extinguish fires faster? What are things that, man, if I just know that this is going to continuously be an issue over and over again, and that's all it's going to be, okay, what can I do to prepare myself for that fire to occur? That I know it's going to occur, but I can get through this fire faster. So I'll give a couple examples here. Is anybody in the IT field by chance? Anybody in the IT field? I always love to ask that first and foremost. Love it. Very good. So I bring this up because if you're in the IT field, I always like to say this at the nerd herd. I always like to say this is you can't stop a server from going down, right? You can't stop a power outage. You can't stop certain things like that. So what do you do? What do you do? What do you do in those cases? Can't stop them from happening. But we can build protocols to navigate them faster, right? Contingencies, risk plans, recovery plans. These are big things that we need to spend time with. In this case, is building the plan sometimes that if we know that something has this, you have a plan to bring this up. So, for example, an extinguishing of a fire that happens is what happens if we have a sick facilitator? What happens there? We have a protocol built in to be able to help with that. What happens if we have situations to where we have a double booking? Sometimes that happens. What do we do there? Well, we have a protocol on the way that we try to re-navigate that with our salespeople and our operations team. And that's where, once again, Aaron, if you go to that place of setting up a calendar to not rebook, then that's where that comes into play. So we have to be able to set this up. We have to be able to look for this. But the idea is when. This is the key question is, when do you look for these? When do you spend time with these? Early on. I love that. I want us to think on that for a minute. What if I love that? And don't want to mispronounce, but I think it's Bhavana. I really love this is what if we spent 15, 20 minutes a day really trying to treat that as if it were a priority? What if that was just sort of what's the fire of the day that we know we need to tackle? What if we shortlisted our biggest fires? So those are things that I actively look for. I try to catch them before they're happening. And so that's one thing that I really like to discuss first and foremost. Yeah, I love that, for instance. What can go wrong? We need to be able to ask ourselves those questions. And yes, we tackle our biggest fires first. So great stuff to start, folks. I really love that. Such great dialogue too. Love the engagement that's coming out of this. So then that leads me to another question. How do you currently plan larger projects? Do you run your day or does your day run you? I'm sure the answer is yes. Most things I run, some things I, don't. But think about how you currently plan your projects and your days. Stand ups. Okay, good. Mostly plan. Evaluation. Take the moments for reflection. I do love that. Daily scrums. Tentative versus must-haves, breaking that down. Building roadmaps and defining milestones. That, I love that, Anitha, is looking at where the roadmaps and milestones occur into play. What happens when you just have this giant looming thing that needs to be taken care of and you know it's going to be a long haul? A long haul. What I love to use in this case is what's called CBT. And no, it's not necessarily cognitive-based therapy, although it kind of functions a little bit kind of like that in a way. But yes, this is what we call the chunk, block, and tackle. I'm a huge fan of prioritization, chunking, and then really spending time with blocking. The purple time are my blocks. That's my purple time, is blocking. And so in this case, what I typically try to do, and this is I'm going to tell you that some of the greatest people that do this are authors. You know, if I asked you all, ready? If I asked you all to write a book, how many of you would absolutely be like, I could totally write a book, no problem whatsoever? How many of you are like, please don't make me write a book? I do not want to do that. There we go. And here's where I'm going to start thinking from this is going to be from a psychological construct. How many of you could run a half marathon? In a What I love about this, John, is that's a great answer is in a year after X amount of time if I'm being chased. But here's where we look at this and why I want you to think deeper for a second. Why do you think I'm asking these questions? Learn a new language. How many of you could learn a new language? I love that term is how do we eat an elephant? And the thing, and that's, does profanity count? I always say I'm from Pittsburgh, John. So sometimes that sort of sneaks in as a second language once in a while. I won't have it today though. But in this case, I love this because think of the psychological construct you're building in your mind. This isn't the art of procrastination. I mean, I want us to think about this is when we go through this, I want us to have a little bit of an understanding of what the mental roadblocks are that get into our minds. And most times, what's happening is we're looking at this big area of just this huge piece of information that we need to take on. And it's exhausting and it's daunting and it takes a lot out of us. So, what I try to do instead is I try to put these into chunks and I try to take these into segments. And I try to say, okay, let's break these off into pieces. And are there things that we can do to sort of chunk this information and build this brick by brick? And that's what I try to look at is how can I sort of chunk this information and make this a little bit easier so that I don't have to build this all at once. And so as I do this, I always like to mention first and foremost that you have to create what are called your chapters. I always like to create your chapters. And does that mean that it can't be agile? Of course it can. But you have to at least start with what your chapters are. So we had this giant, large project of condensing multiple businesses into one and having a lot of the same curriculum that's not going to have overlap and things like that. That was a huge project and an undertaking to take on. So what we had to do is chunk these pieces. And what we did was we wrote chapters first. And the chapters were, okay, let's break this down by our segments, right? First and foremost, let's start with segments. And so when we went with our segments, I always like to mention this because when we went to our segments, the first thing here that we talked about was saying, okay, how do we break down our different courses? And so we broke them into chapters: process leadership, personal leadership, strategic leadership. Okay, great. But even still, that's too many courses. It's too many courses. It's too many things. How do we break those down? Okay. We'll break them down into process leadership is two different things. It's the business analysis and the business process improvement. We have personal leadership, leading the self. Okay, well, part of that self development where it's kind of truly leading ourselves internally. And then it's kind of leading ourselves in the way we communicate with others, which is interpersonal communication. Then there's strategic, which is the managerial and the organizational. And this allowed us to really break pieces down. You're breaking your giant rocks into smaller pebbles. Even still, what we did was say, well, we could even break this down further. Are these certifications or these actual workshops? That made life so much easier to break the information down. Then, once we broke it down, we blocked off times as early as possible to start looking at which courses do we need to work on first? Which courses do we need to make sure that are the correct ones? And so we prioritize that with data. And then we got them all on our calendar. After that, what I have to say is if you're going to tackle it, you need to tackle it and brace yourself for this question. How many of you actually use your DND function, whether it's in Teams or Slack or whatever it is? How many of you actually use your DND? Or by accident? I want us to think about why we don't for a minute. Why don't we? Yep. And if there's cases of always have to be on call, fair. We don't want to appear to be unavailable. It can be a negative perception. All right. I'm going to say this. And on a scale of 1 to 10, I want you to think about how hard this hits you whenever I say this. I'm going to teach you something that is really important. You do not always have to be available. I will say that again. You do not always have to be available. However, when you are available, you must always be visible and present and engaged. I will say that again. You do not always have to be available. But when you are available, you do have to be visible, present, and engaged. That's why, and I am, yeah, video on. I do not multitask. I am in when I am in. And I say this because how many of you could probably, whether it's even a request of twice a day, I need two 15-minute segments where I need to go into DND. Just two. Think about that. Seeing a lot of, yeah, you know what? I could do that. That's doable. I always say if you can find 2 to 4, and 4 is too many, 4 is too many, that's no worries. But I say this because that pocket, I want you to do a little math in the way that this adds up. If you had two 15-minute segments of uninterrupted time a day, you would have 2.5 hours a week, you'd have 10 hours a month, and you'd have 120 extra hours of productivity a year. A year. And if there's 52 weeks, you got to add a couple extra weeks. You're probably looking at about 125 extra hours of productivity. So how many of you think to yourself, man, there's not enough time in a day? Day's too short? Ready? Here is your challenge for today. What I want you to do, and I'm going to give everybody a couple moments and it will be silent just for this webinar. I just want you to pick a spot tomorrow and I want you to block off two 15-minute segments where they are actual DNDs. And great question. How much time do you spend on planning, chunking, breaking down? Typically, I do it whenever the greatest, and I know that it's going to sound like, oh, there are no lulls, but what I really try to do is find the time when nobody really quite is in. So I'm an early bird. And so I know from like 7:30 to 8, that's normally my planning time that I can really get stuff taken care of before getting interrupted. And I just do that once a week. Once a week. If once again, it's like cleaning your room. Like if you stay on top of it, it doesn't take long to map out the rest of your week. It could be from 4:30 to 5. I don't get hit as much from 4:30 to 5. Other good questions. What happens about handling the micromanagers? I always love. So here's the question I always bring up with micromanagers. Number one, I always assume positive intent at first, right? I always assume positive intent. Are they just really wanting to be involved, or are they really just truly having to have that grasp? What I typically try to do in that case is I assume positive intent first. If they really are that person that just, boy, they just really want to be micromanaging everything, what I like to say is, you know what, I'm packing 15 minutes of D&D. If there's something you want to see, I could be able to put that into my 15 minutes. Makes them feel like they're included and they have some control, and then you can still be able to do the things you need to achieve. So I really try, and absolutely. So then, Scott, the other thing is 7+ hours of meetings. I do know that feeling a lot. I am in meetings often. That's why what I typically try to do, Scott, is the proactive versus the reactive. Is the proactive is I go to next week and I actually plan out my purple time for the following week in advance before anything gets booked. And if something does get booked, if anything does get booked, I always say, unfortunately, I have an immovable meeting. Because think about it. If you were in a meeting with somebody else and somebody else tried to schedule you, you would tell them, I can't make this meeting because I'm already here. So treat it as if it's a meeting for yourself. And it's not about taking advantage, but it is about trying to say, my time is also important. And it could be, Marion, right? And that's the thing is, if it's movable, then I don't get rid of the 15 minutes. I just move it back. Has this been helpful so far, folks? Awesome. Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. Excellent. Then the next thing I'm going to show you is a strategy on how I prioritize. How I prioritize. And I do use what's called the UI matrix. I do use what's called the UI matrix, also known as the Eisenhower matrix. But what I typically do is this. If there is truly an urgent and important fire, and I really have to stress that the key word is also that it has to be important, not just something of, oh, this needs to get done right now. Does it? Does it really? And the way I define urgent and important is if I was on vacation or if I was actually really out of office, heaven forbid, and I'm going to use the positive example and not the example I normally use is what if I hit the lottery and I was gone tomorrow? I actually use the bus example because the bus seems more likely to me than hitting the lottery. But what if I was hit by a bus? What would happen? How would it be taken care of? And so I really have to define the constructs of what is urgent and important. And if it is urgent and important, the answer is I do it now. I absolutely do it now. I also follow David Allen. I don't know if anybody's ever heard of David Allen. He's getting a free sort of shout out, but I do like David Allen. But there is sort of GTD theory is if it takes 2 minutes or less, I will also do it. I will also do it. But I'm a huge fan of, but I really, the key word that he doesn't talk about that I really have to stress is you have to define why it's important. So I'll give a good example. I had a sick facilitator, very ill, made it about 2/3 through the day, was really struggling in the last part of it. Actually had neuroadvisor was sick, was absolutely sick. And they were like, I don't think he can continue. I don't know what to do. And so the thing that we did was I said, well, he has 90 minutes remaining. What is he left with? Could we move this to a remote piece? First and foremost was the first thing. That wasn't a viable option there. The second piece is hey, could we set up sort of a 90-minute webinar for the last piece where you could do this remotely for another day the next time that you all have your all meeting? And that's what we did. But I had to hop in that call now with the client, with operations, with to make sure that we could do this. That had to be done then and there. That is urgent and it's important. The problem is that how many of you get an email, you see an email immediately, and you answer said email, try to answer said email right away? Is that urgent and important? Is that urgent and important? And that's the question, Natalie. The question we have to define is what is the construct that makes that email important? What is the construct that makes that important? That's the part that I really want us to understand because sometimes we've seen, I'm sure some of us have seen this model already. The thing that doesn't get talked about enough is defining what the construct is. And that's the thing, Carla, is organizational constructs could be one. Could be one. Right? So if it's something of, hey, I work for a help desk and that help desk absolutely needs to be responded to within 20 minutes, completely understand. Right, Myra. How long should we be paying attention to these emails that are coming in and doing this? The other piece that I try to pay attention to based on importance is, and I'm going to tell you where this comes into play. There's 5 factors that typically go into importance. Number 1 is value. What value does this bring to the overall part of the organization? What value does this bring to the overall arching part of the organization? Number 2 is source. And I say this because, yes, if my C-suite needs something from me, I probably need to prioritize this and I probably need to make that urgent and important. Yeah. Yeah, it might need to happen. Sometimes that's the case. The other thing is cost. How much is this going to cost us if I don't? Next is timeline. And by timeline, I mean, if somebody needs documentation, I love to ask the question, and I'm going to tell you that you are allowed to buy yourself more time. And the way you have to phrase this question is as follows. When is the absolute latest you need this by? When is the absolute latest you need this by? You would be surprised the answers you get whenever that comes into play. Because we always think everything's on fire, and then we ask that question and they go, oh, I probably by end of week. And you go, oh, that's no longer urgent. That's no longer urgent. So timeline is a huge piece I love to ask. And the last thing I have to consider is risk. What is the risk in this not being solved? What is the risk of this? And I have to be very realistic about risk. It can't be that the world's going to burn down and that everything's going to go, in the worst way possible. I have to really evaluate risk. And it's not something you have to do this massive sort of algorithm to figure out. But as you're seeing this, you're going, well, the source of this is pretty high here. Or do you know what? If I don't do this, this does create a much greater risk to the implementation of our business. That's kind of where we're paying attention to that. These are the constructs that we really have to consider around the UI matrix. And so if it's urgent but not important, I delegate it. Now, that may mean that if there might be an option that if I get the choice, I might be able to delegate it to another person. But if I don't, then I'm not going to be able to. I'm going to have to delegate it to another time and space. Another time and space. And normally that's where my blockouts for purple time come into play. Is like, this is something I can't do right now. I can't, this is going to have to be on like what I call like my to-do list, right? So if I have my to-do list, I put it to my to-do list and say, this is something that I need to keep an eye out in front of me to make sure that I have this down. So I'll delegate it to a to-do list, or I'll delegate it to another person that may even have a little bit more knowledge or information that can be taken care of. So you have to delegate in this case. The reason why I bring this up is because if we spend all the time in the world on the urgent, guess what starts to get ignored? The important. This is the box where that things fall by the wayside, and then what happens is they turn into urgent and important. So what I do with important but not urgent, this is growth of our business. This is sort of strategies that we're building in, vision, approaches. These are the things that are really the Smokey the Bear things that come into play. What I do here is I dictate. And what I mean by dictate is I'm going to get this on my calendar. I'm going to block off time as if it's a meeting with myself that is a truly high priority issue, but it might not be today, but I know that I'm setting myself up for the next week and making sure that I am dictating that this is a high priority item. I've dictated this and said, yes, this is highest priority. I'm putting this on calendar for next week. I'm treating this as if this is a meeting with myself. And if you want to go one step further, I create what's called a self agenda. And I put in a brief agenda as if I was having a meeting with somebody else. I put in a brief agenda with myself. So I have to be the one that dictates that. And I get it out in front of me to where it is now a meeting with myself. And if it's not urgent and it's not important, I delete it out of my mind for the time being. That doesn't necessarily mean deleting the email per se. It could be referencing it. I always say like something not urgent and not important. And I know some of you may disagree, but like holidays for the year, right? Great. It's good to know I'm going to have days off, right? But at that time and in that moment, that's going to be an archive. That's going to be go into a reference file that I have for later. Great to know, but I'm deleting it out of my mind. I'm not living in that space. So, Natalie, great question here. Isn't dictating a time the same as delegating it to a different time? I always say that if it's a delegation versus a dictation, delegation means I'm just writing it down and I'll get to it kind of when I get to it. Dictation has a little bit more of a firmness to it to where I'm saying, no, this is going to be done at this time, this designated spot. This is my meeting with myself. I want to just stress this a little bit because with delegation, there's a little bit of this sort of openness in the delegation to where there's a little bit more freedom in this, whereas dictation is much more of an effort to say, no, there is no negotiation with myself. This is getting done at this time, at this scope, at this place. Does that make sense, Natalie? That is such a fantastic question. I don't get that question often, and that is an amazing question. That's excellent. And people are agreeing with that, Natalie. That's an amazing question because when we think delegation, delegation is we sort of pass it off. It's a passing. So I might pass it to my to-do list and say, I'll get to it when I get to it. It's important, but it's there. But the idea of dictation is no, this is truly important. This gets on my calendar. I'm creating an agenda. I'm treating it as that goes. Excellent, excellent, excellent. Well, then, folks, we have about 8 minutes remaining. Good question, Bethany. How frequently should we be moving these items around on our matrix? The goal is this is a perfect question. I love this. Normally, the way the cycle happens, and I'm going to tell you sort of the rough way it happens and then the way we would love it to happen. Typically, what happens is we live in these two areas over and over again and drain ourselves out and drain our battery. What our goal is to really try to do is to minimize this area. It's going to happen. If it does, then that's perfect. But the goal is that we spend more time here because this is where we are the captains of our ship and things aren't happening to us, but we are making it happen. So I'm going to say that if you're spending a lot more time on this left side, what we need to start doing is defining what are these these things and getting out in front of it. Because if we don't, Bethany, then what happens is everything becomes this all over again. So I was just about to ask questions of the Q&A and like, what questions do we have here? But you all are already asking amazing questions, so we're diving into this. And Donald, that goes back to the first point in full circle. I love that you brought it home for us is that's why it's proactive and not reactive. The left side of that matrix is a little bit more reactive because things are happening to us. Now I'm going to pass it over to Mariella. I think Mariella, if there's questions I did miss, I try to catch a lot as we were in the chat to make it collaborative and dialogue driven.
Yeah, absolutely. I have a couple here. You let me know if you answered this one because I know you answered another one around the same time when you were talking about categories for your calendar. Um, Someone asked, can you share your categories with us as an example of how to set ours up?
Yes. So to recap that part, what I was saying is you can break down categories by as follows. So for me, and just pulling mine up a little bit, is I break my team down a little bit more by typically I do it departmentally. So sales, operations, marketing, products. I break it down that way. My own teaching team. If I am teaching, it goes all yellow. So if I'm doing an event of some kind, that's normally an all-day block off. But in this case, I try to break it down departmentally, but other people will break it down by their UI matrix. They may break it down by like, hey, and they may not put in their bottom part, but if it's important or urgent, they may mark those off as red to where they have to get those things taken care of, right? And so how do we get those things taken care of there?
Awesome. And I just wanted to reiterate because I saw a couple of these. Just in case you didn't see the chat, you will absolutely be getting a recording of this entire session in your email in case you weren't able to attend the full session. So we should be all good to go on that field. And I believe that should be it for us, unless you didn't get to some of these, but I believe you already got to a
There's
good
only two
portion of
left that
these.
I see, Mariella. One is the David Allen book is Getting Things Done. Definitely a great resource. There's other ones too. There's many of sources out there. Big piece on that. The other thing that I like to that was asked is, do I create a UI matrix weekly, monthly, or as things come in? I really do try to do it weekly. I try to do it the Friday afternoon when my brain is fried, and it just allows me to just kind of regather and get myself ready for the next week. So typically Friday afternoons, whenever I'm really just starting to run out of steam a little bit, I try to go through that. How do you great question. And Lenise, thank you. That was asked, and I'm so glad you brought up that question. How do you navigate those that refuse to use your up-to-date calendar? What I typically say is I am unavailable at this time. I am not available currently. If there is something you truly need, I will reshare my calendar with you so that you have access to it. But this is the system that is being used. We want to make sure that we're using this. And I use what's called we language in that, Lenny, so that it's not you, it's we, it's us. This is a system we're using. That's a great
Excellent.
question. Thank you for asking that again. I really don't like missing this.
No, yeah, absolutely. And I think Christina asked if could throw up that reactive versus proactive slide again, just so we
Yep.
can take a quick look over that. And just wanted to let you all know that I dropped that link in the chat to find out a little bit more about this. Awesome.
Yeah, I just think the biggest thing is that when we're remote, it's very much out of sight versus out of mind mentality. And then what we run into is we have to start being more actively proactive in our approaches. And for instance, we didn't get into email management. We do that in another seminar, but I do have a couple extra minutes. I am a huge fan of inbox zero as an approach. I can show that very briefly. And I actually don't have many emails in here because I did a little bit of a cleanup on this as we go through. But just to kind of share a little bit is, I have a couple emails that came in during this webinar. I promise I don't have seven, right? I don't have seven emails. If I go to my sent items, I use that as a reference. I have about 20,000. And so what I typically do in this case is I set up folders the same way I do categories for my calendar management. And what I do is I break it down. In this case, I have it by our leadership team, our facilitation team, our marketing products, operations, and our sales team, and then some HR components. And so within that, every person has a folder. Once again, the work up front is a challenge and you got to dig deep on that. But once it's done, it's so much easier maintenance. Like we just completed this webinar that goes into my marketing and products folder, and then I move on from there.
Gorgeous. Love that. Love that approach. Beautiful. And I think that looks like we have a couple of awesome little comments here, but so far, I think that will be all of our questions for the session. So thank you all so much for attending and for engaging and throwing some great questions. And if you need any more info on this topic, please do not be afraid to visit us at watermarklearning.com or click that link that I dropped earlier in the chat. And again, if you miss out on any part of this session, we will absolutely be sending that recording to you.
And we have really cool updates that are coming and things like that. I am on LinkedIn. Feel free to reach out. Always happy to see what we got going. But other than that, thank you for joining me and take care.
Absolutely. Thanks everyone for joining us, and we'll see you very soon, hopefully in the classroom. Bye now.